Hello and welcome to part one of the IPControl API Quick Start. And I'm David Cross, and I'm going to walk you through a couple concepts today of the IPControl APIs. And I imagine that this video series for the evaluations will be probably 3 or 4 different videos. Hopefully they won't be too long. However, there's a lot to discuss. And there's a number of different APIs that we'll cover, different concepts we'll cover, such as the API, the command line interfaces, which are available through the shell and or a client. And then, of course, we have XML and some other concepts, too, that we work with. And I want to kind of go over some basics, how we organize and structure APIs. We can go through some examples. And then as we kind of break out into their individual categories, we'll get into some more detail, get into some actual usage, and we'll go through some of that here in this particular video as well. Now, the first thing that we need to kind of envision here when we think of the IPControl APIs is the APIs, because there are several, are served by the IPControl Executive Tomcat web services. The APIs are Java components that we build that generate the various WSDL and other type configurations for both SOAP-XML formatted APIs and then also RESTFUL APIs that use JSON, which have been released basically since our 8.0 version. And the XML APIs and SOAP-XML have been around for, since our version 3 of this. So we're at version 11 now. So we've been through a lot of iterations of the concepts. Now, in order to really understand how the APIs are broken out, each of the IPControl executives within the Tomcat, there is some web apps that include the Inc WS, which is a SOAP-XML web services. There's an Inc REST, which is the Inc RESTful APIs. And those WAR files get unloaded, which unload their APIs and all of their web configurations for these services. When you install secondary executives who also have Tomcat, these APIs are also available. And whatever JDBC connectivity that they're communicating with behind the executive also will talk to their executive database and services. The cloud automation appliance, as you kind of get into that, if you've seen any of the previous videos, will actually talk to an executive IP and its backup IP. And it not only provides the Node-RED workflows, but it in addition has all of the web services and Inc REST APIs listed and available to proxy to whichever executive you're currently choosing. So just to kind of cover that concept and to kind of back up about how we organize this. And especially as we get into the RESTful APIs, you'll see that we don't necessarily follow the standard REST API structure where it's URL encoded and within brackets to represent objects and lookup fields and so on. We have decided, because we have been so long supporting the XML APIs, that we really wanted our developers to be able to migrate easily. So we have effectively used the same naming nomenclature for all of the APIs. And all of the APIs, regardless of format, are discussed within both your IPControl documentation and the CLI API guide, or if you navigate to the Swagger page, the PDF guide here as well. So the key there and the advantage of that was then that all of the APIs are familiar, the same names, the same concept, capabilities, so that you don't have to learn 2 different API structures. You just have to worry about the data construct, the XML, and then the JSON. So the organization of our APIs and how we catalog these are basically through different namespaces. Those namespaces, and to kind of get a better view of this, because these through XML kind of really represent this and moving forward with REST. The categories or namespaces are task invocation, and these are case sensitive, by the way. And if you navigate to the XML page and click WSDL, you'll see the actual XML structure and their JSON or XML components. So within the task, you have then various methods. These methods are mostly verbs, where we're going out and doing things where we can get the task and do other things, right? So the task invocation namespace, we then have a delete namespace for deleting IP addresses or other types of data, an imports namespace This is for importing, which we also have doubled up our import procedures to also include modification. So if you go out and perhaps get an IP device and it has an ID, if you modify the fields and then import it, it'll modify that data to making it simple to use the same functional routines for all of the different import and modifications. You just have to tweak the data again to that particular task. And then we have the gets API namespace. And this is where we're going to have it so you can go out and do basically single data element gets, like by IP, by subnet, by pool, by range, things like it. And then the exports. And I will say that the exports, as we started, are a little bit more complex. And specifically when working with the exports in XML, you have to deal with what they call session IDs and manipulating the XML to transfer that between the different calls. But the key behind the exports is there is an initialization call, which is basically init, the name of the export API. So you'll have an init API. This typically sets up where you pass in query data or whatever the filters are you're trying to locate in terms of exporting data based on that requirement or filter. So the initialization effectively sets up the query. The export actually runs that query. It's basically passing in a context. So the init creates a context, pass the context into the export, and then you can either do things like pagination by passing the context repeatedly into the export, returning a number of rows that you've defined, or you can just say export everything and then run an end export, which will clean up behind that process, which basically builds temporary files and so forth. So it is a three-part process effectively when you deal with exporting and specifically when dealing with SOAP-XML. Now that changes when we get to REST, and I'm going to cover that detail. But within the namespaces, this is the namespace we use for those services. And then lastly, you have this inc use next reserved IP address, which is a very long API name, but a namespace for setting up reservation ranges that are specific to a device type in IPControl. Then you call this API requesting that device type. It then converts a reserve to a static, builds its name, and you can only pass some limited fields to it because it's just designed to get the next available, really. But it's useful for reserving and controlling the address space that perhaps your clients can acquire IP addresses from automatically or if using automation. All right, so that is the namespace, and I'm going to kind of back up now, and I want to go in and cover the REST APIs, because I think that in the REST API sense, you're going to have more luck with this, just be quicker to get adjusted to and quicker for you to start working with, especially because we have an application and a documentation tool called Swagger, which is also located on those executive services. Now, one thing to note about HTTP or REST APIs is we only support HTTPS, especially because it is a plain text JSON. SOAP, on the other hand, is a very complex body data structure that obfuscates, if you will, some of that data, making it less easy to look on the wire. So it can work over HTTP or HTTPS, but REST is only HTTPS. The IP address :8443 and then your inc-rest/API/docs/index.html will bring you to the Swagger page where you can then authorize yourself to begin browsing and or working with these APIs. And so that's effectively what we're going to do. And if you have an IPControl executive handy, the one key point is to note in your administrator definitions, if you're running IPControl, actually any version, 8 and above for REST, your users themselves in their policies, click on this link and then look in the policies tab. You must have the ability to do both WebUI and CLI. Or if you're running IPControl 8, it may just say 8 and 9, it may just say CLI and web. So you might want to make sure you enable CLI. Okay, that's for the API and for the command line interfaces which are available, which we'll have a separate video discussing. And then from a documentation standpoint, we can go ahead and click on the PDF. Actually, you might have to log into your application first, and I need to do that back over here. If you go to the home page and look at under the additional information, IP control, and then click on your IP control CLI API guide, there's various ways to look at this, and it kind of includes everything that we do from CLI and all of the APIs. The forward part of the documentation is all going to cover CLIs. So if you're looking for, importing things in a shell, this is where we would look at, and we'll have a video for this. If you're looking, say, for an import and you want to look at an IP device or logins or something like that, you can certainly search for it and do import device. And you should also see under the application programming section an equivalent, because these do effectively match to their CLI counterparts. And the way that you would then read these, if you're looking at the RESTful APIs, is it goes through and it tells you effectively the elements and the type that you're going to pass into the device. So we know that this is going to be a post, and in the post, we need to have various elements that are passing, telling us the type of device and the specific elements and parameters. So when you're looking at documentation and you're using the Swagger interface, you're going to need both. And the reason you're going to need both is as you start to look at the Swagger and you want to look at things like importing an address pool, we're going to show you the schema effectively of everything that's available for this particular object type, if you will, of the JSON object we can represent for the pool or device and IP. Not all of these fields are required, and not all of these fields are going to have values. So we don't want to include things that do not have values, and we need to make sure that we don't just leave the string value showing you the types, like whether they're Boolean, whether they're an array of strings, if you're looking at these. So you're going to need to, kind of configure these JSON structures, if you will, based on how you deal with data. Now, also note that as you're working with information, if you want to go out and see what that format looks like to help you along the way, there's typically a get function where you can go out and get a pull or get a function to pull back an existing JSON. So if I wanted to go out and say, look for that, I could then look into the JSON and find wherever I'm at here and go out and possibly pull that back. But I'm going to do it by device because I don't know what my pulls are. So in the device itself, let's do a get device by IP device. And I believe I have a router. We'll do this like so. Okay. Now, a couple things to note too, just if you're trying this real quick, there is an authorize function. This authorized function should be that login for your INC admin or your INC users, IP control users. And if you're going to be doing any imports, you want to set the right IPC, which is required to effectively write anything to it. So just as a real quick example in the get function and kind of the structure of this as you look through it, the get function tells you the type of HTTP request, get, post, delete. The implementation notes will tell you a little bit about this, and it should tell you then what the status is in terms of the response. So in the headers, we should expect a status 200. It'll show you the model, which is literally the schema, what's optional along the way. It'll also show you the various constructs of any embedded objects like the interfaces when we deal with devices and so forth. The example that you see here gives you basically the string example. And whenever there's kind of a get function, you can do import fields. And so this is how that would be structured. And this is telling you what we're looking for of an existing device. If there's any kind of faults, you would see here the fault model and also its output and what it should look like. So if you see a fault string in the payload or whatever that response is to this get, you know that that's an error. And then lastly, and the benefit of this tool and kind of working through this, there are a number of videos I've already created that kind of walk through some of the IP control APIs and using curl and syntax. But just so you know, without having to go through those, these here allow you basically through curl, showing you almost the exact syntax, with the authorization bearer tokens that we use for authentication. So this shows you basically how to do this. You can cut and paste, of course, adding any type of checking the security certificates and skipping it and others. Here's the request URL, and this is effectively your API endpoint. So if you are calling this in a GET HTTP request from your JavaScript application, you would be calling this API, passing it probably a variable, and its response then is a JSON object of a WS device, which again is also discussed in WS device syntax of what's returned and the syntax here. So these two together, when you're dealing with the REST and the APIs, work hand in hand to help you understand what you're trying to input, what's required, and then here you can see the output and its capability and its response codes and response headers. So this is, I'm going to kind of leave it here because of the time, and then I'm going to come back in more detail, and we're going to go through some examples of the exports and the API specifically for exports, and some of the quick capabilities we have through the new init capabilities in REST. So thanks for joining with me. I hope that was a good overview initially, and we're going to get into more detail in the coming up videos. Thanks, have a great day, and look forward to the next video.